He laughed so loud that passers-by turned to look, not knowing the sound of mockery had just pierced the heart of a man who once gave him his last meal. Tunde sat in the comfort of his tinted car, the engine humming softly, while across the road, a familiar figure stood under the scorching sun, shouting the price of boiled and roasted corn to uninterested commuters. The corn seller wore faded clothes and dusty slippers, his stall a shaky wooden tray balanced on concrete blocks, smoke rising from a makeshift charcoal grill beside it. It was Emeka. The same Emeka who once helped Tunde complete his university admission form when he couldn't afford transport to the registration center. The same Emeka who once shared a single room and a loaf of bread with him during the worst storms of their youth. But now, to Tunde, Emeka was just an old memory trapped in poverty, a relic of a life he no longer wanted to be associated with. He chuckled and whispered under his breath as he snapped a photo with his phone and posted it online with a cruel caption, "From classroom to corn cellar, life humbles people." He didn't even know that Emeka saw him. Emeka had seen the car slow down. He had recognized the tinted glass, the custom number plate with Tunde's initials, the faint smell of imported air freshener that drifted as the window cracked. But he did not flinch. He kept tending to his corn, flipping each cob with deliberate patience, the kind only a man with discipline and secrets could afford. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He only smiled to himself quietly and served his next customer with both hands. The people around the stall didn't know they were buying corn from a man who sat on a truth too heavy for even his own heart. Emeka had not always sold corn. He had not planned to either. Just 2 years ago, he had returned to Nigeria under a different name, a quiet identity forged by time, heartbreak, and betrayal. Abroad, he had built something great, something worthy of respect, but had chosen silence over noise, humility over pride. He had learned the hard way that money could invite wolves, and sometimes even your brothers could wear sheep's clothing. That was why he came back in disguise, not with a convoy, not with announcements, but as a simple man walking barefoot through the streets he once roamed as a boy. The corn business was a cover, a way to observe, a test for those who once claimed to love him. He had been monitoring Tunde from afar, watching the rise of the boy he once taught how to write a CV, watching him appear on magazines, pose on red carpets, and drive through the neighborhood without ever looking back at those who carried him when he had no shoes. And now, fate had brought their roads together again. But only one of them knew what was truly happening. Tunde thought he had risen beyond Emeka. He thought that standing next to a street vendor would soil his designer clothes. He didn't know. The vendor held a silent pen that could rewrite his entire destiny. That night, Emeka returned home to a modest apartment in the outskirts of town. The lights were solar-powered, and the inside was clean and minimal. But tucked inside a rusted drawer were documents, bank details, investment portfolios, and land ownership certificates that spelled a truth even Tunde's mind couldn't grasp. Emeka owned 3 major export companies operating in silence under proxies. He had started them after leaving the country and had made his first $1 million within 2 years. But he didn't want fame. He didn't want headlines. He wanted healing. He wanted to know who really loved him when there was no perfume to cover his sweat. He chose the corn stall because it reminded him of his mother. She had died selling roasted corn, with her wrapper tied tight and her hands always smelling of burnt maize. Emeka had promised her grave that he would never forget where he came from. And so the corn was not shameful to him. It was sacred. A memorial. A symbol of his humility, disguised as labor. But for Tunde, who now flaunted every opportunity as if it were oxygen, Emeka's choice looked like failure. And in that misunderstanding lay the storm that was about to change everything. The photo Tunde posted went viral overnight. The comments poured in, some mocking, others feeling sorry. But what none of them knew was that a silent account under E, the name Mr. E, had just transferred 20 million naira to an anonymous foundation supporting street vendors. And from that foundation, the very next day, 5 other corn sellers across town would receive packages with brand new stalls, umbrellas, licenses, and cash. Emeka was quietly spreading his kindness, just not in the ways people expected. As the days passed, Tunde kept checking his post, proud of the reactions, proud of his status, unaware that the very man he mocked was about to be the reason his world came crashing down. Emeka had already made a decision. He had seen enough. The past had returned, and now the reckoning would begin, not with noise, not with revenge, but with truth so quiet it would burn like fire through dry leaves. It began with one call, one document, one meeting, and a surprise that would shake Tunde to his core. But for now, the corn still roasted, the customers still came, and Emeka still smiled with the grace of a man who had been both dust and diamond. The office erupted into silence the moment the envelope dropped on Tunde's table. It wasn't a noisy kind of arrival. It didn't come with police sirens or media attention. It came in a plain brown file, slipped in by the receptionist who had no idea what she was carrying. Tunde, who was preparing for a televised panel where he'd be introduced as one of Nigeria's youngest real estate moguls, barely glanced at it. But the name on the top corner wasn't just familiar, it was haunting. It read, Emeka Nwachukwu Holdings. His smile froze. The air shifted. Something deep in his chest clenched like a fist. He hadn't seen that name since university. He thought Emeka had vanished. He thought the boy who once helped him find a place to stay during NYSC had disappeared into poverty or worse. But now, that name sat quietly on a legal document addressed to him. And what followed inside that envelope would shatter everything Tunde thought he had built. Inside was a short letter, printed in a font so clean it felt clinical, almost surgical, in its precision. It congratulated Tunde on his recent business growth and informed him, with legally binding courtesy, that the land beneath his newest office tower was no longer his. It had been bought, silently, quietly, and completely, by Emeka Nwachukwu Holdings through a network of silent agents. The deal had closed 2 months ago. His tower now stood on land he no longer owned. Worse, a clause in the initial lease agreement meant that once the land changed hands, the new owner had the right to review, revoke, or restructure all contracts related to the property. The office tower, his prized achievement, was now at the mercy of a man he had publicly humiliated just days ago. At first, Tunde thought it was a prank. He laughed, a hollow laugh, then called his legal advisor, only to hear a trembling voice confirm the worst. Not only was the transaction real, it was airtight. There was nothing he could do. Emeka had outplayed him with the same calmness he once used to explain mathematics back in the classroom. Tunde didn't sleep that night. His social media was still buzzing with likes and laughing emojis under his mocking photo of Emeka, but his mind was far away, trapped in memories of when the two of them were brothers in everything but blood. He remembered how Emeka once stayed up all night to help him study for a scholarship test, how Emeka shared his last plate of food when Tunde's allowance didn't come in. And now that same man had taken away the very foundation, literally, of his business empire, without raising his voice or breaking a sweat. The next day, Tunde drove to the same corn stall. It was still there, quietly nestled under the same roadside tree, with a little green umbrella now shading it from the sun. But Emeka was gone. In his place stood a teenage boy wearing a fresh apron and smiling with the kind of peace that Tunde hadn't felt in years. The boy offered him a cob of corn. Tunde didn't respond. He just stared, his throat too tight for even pride to rise. And then he saw it. Pinned to the side of the stall was a small laminated card that read, Empowered by EN Foundation, Dignity in Every Labor. That was when it clicked. Emeka had not just bought the land, he had bought back his narrative. He had turned mockery into a movement. That stall, once a symbol of shame in Tunde's eyes, had now become a cornerstone of quiet revolution, and he had played right into Emeka's plan. Across town, more stalls had started appearing, each branded with the same card. Vendors began dressing better, selling cleaner, and earning more. Emeka's foundation was now funding over 50 micro-vendors, all operating under strict dignity guidelines. No handouts, just structured empowerment. Tunde felt small, not because he had lost land, but because he had lost character. In his hunger for power, he had forgotten where he came from. He had mocked the very person who once gave him his first business idea, the one who believed in slow growth and honest hands. Emeka, now shielded by wealth and wisdom, had done more with corn than Tunde had done with millions. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows on the pavement, Tunde finally understood that money wasn't power, character was. Emeka hadn't sought revenge. He had offered a mirror, and what Tunde saw in that reflection was not flattering. He returned to his car slowly, his movements heavy. The boy at the stall waved politely, not knowing who he was or what he had done. For the first time in years, Tunde felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: remorse. But it was too late for apologies. The damage was done. The land was gone. The trust was broken. And the post he had made still lived online, spreading ignorance like wildfire. That night he opened his laptop and began drafting a letter. Not to Emeka, not to the media, but to himself. A letter of truth, a letter of admission, a letter of change. He didn't know what he'd do next. But for the first time, he wanted to be a man Emeka could one day respect again, if life allowed it. A white envelope arrived again, but this time it bore gold-embossed edges and was delivered not by courier or secretary, but by a man in traditional agbada, who entered the lobby like he owned the building. The staff at Tunde's office stared, as he walked in with calm command, handed the envelope directly to the receptionist, and left without a word. The envelope was addressed not to Tunde, but to a Mr. Chief M. Adisa, a major real estate magnate, whose name Tunde had only heard whispered. In elite circles, Tunde wouldn't have thought much of it until he saw the return name, N Group Headquarters. Emeka Nwachukwu. Again. That name was becoming a haunting rhythm in his life. But this wasn't just any invitation. Inside was a glossy black card, thick and elegant, engraved with gold lettering, by special invitation, the launch of the Corn Legacy Initiative, a national empowerment movement for street entrepreneurs, hosted by Emeka Nwachukwu. Tunde's throat ran dry. The venue, the Presidential Banquet Hall, Abuja. The dress code, traditional with pride. The keynote speaker, Emeka himself. The man he once laughed at now stood at the center of something national, something presidential, something powerful. But what twisted the blade deeper wasn't the guest list or the location. It was the attached program booklet. Among the featured honorees was a photo of an elderly woman, hands folded, wearing a faded wrapper under the title, Posthumous Recognition, Mama Ngozi, Matriarch of Dignified Labor. Tunde knew that name. It was Emeka's late mother, the corn seller he used to greet every evening as he walked home from school. She had died without recognition, buried in a community cemetery with no gravestone. But now, her legacy was being honored before kings and ministers. Tunde sank into his office chair, the weight of his pride crashing down. His team buzzed with news of the event. Social media was already hyping the launch, calling it the redefinition of hustle, and the moment Nigeria's forgotten streets came into the spotlight. Photos leaked of Emeka in flowing white agbada, surrounded by street vendors, dressed in matching Ankara uniforms. It wasn't charity. It was elegance wrapped in humility. Tunde didn't receive an invitation. He wasn't on the list. His team tried to pull strings, but every door was quietly closed. One even said bluntly, "Mr. Emeka does not wish to associate with those who shame dignity." The words stung. They echoed in his ears like a warning bell. His empire, though intact, suddenly felt hollow. He walked through his newest development site later that week, a luxury estate built on land he once celebrated. But the workers avoided his gaze. They had seen the viral posts, They had read the comments. The nation now knew what he had done. Even his tenants whispered. Some began pulling out, slowly, politely, citing public image concerns. What he had once considered a harmless laugh now rippled into lost respect and declining influence. It was death by silence, no lawsuits, no scandals, just honor exposing dishonor. Then, just when he thought he had hit the lowest point, another envelope came, this time to his home. He opened it cautiously. No branding, no letterhead, just a single sheet of paper. It read, "We do not need enemies when friends betray us with laughter. May this reminder shape the man you become." Attached was a photo, an old one, a faded image of two boys sitting under a mango tree, eating boiled corn from a single piece of newspaper. One of the boys wore torn shorts and held the larger cob, offering the smaller one to his friend. That friend was Tunde. The boy sharing the corn was Emeka. It was a picture only the two of them could have possessed. Tunde sat in silence for a long time. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just stared. And when he finally stood up, he knew what had to be done. Not to save his image, not to fix the land deal, but to confront the man he once called brother. That night, he took his car and drove through the darkened city. The roads were quiet, the streetlights flickering like ghosts guiding his guilt. He found the corn stall still open, only now it had grown. A new canopy, more staff, a small LED sign that read, "Legacy Stall Mar 1, the taste of respect." It wasn't just a stall anymore. It was a flagship, a brand, a beginning. He didn't get out of the car. He sat across the road and watched. The staff were laughing. A child passed by and waved. The corn roasted golden in the firelight. And then, from a black SUV that pulled up quietly, Emeka stepped out. He looked calm, clean, dressed in kaftan and sandals. He walked over to the stall, said nothing, helped rearrange a tray, handed out 2 cobs of corn to passing kids, and simply smiled. Tunde wanted to open his door, to shout, to apologize, to explain. But his hands wouldn't move. His mouth was dry. His pride still chained him, even in shame. He drove off without a word. That night, he couldn't sleep again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a soul being rebuilt, brick by brick, from the ruins of arrogance. The story wasn't over yet. Emeka hadn't closed the book. But the pages ahead would depend on what Tunde did next. And that next chapter had to begin, not with a public gesture, but with a private truth. It began with a single cob of corn, quietly placed at the base of a statue. The statue wasn't grand, it wasn't plated in gold or polished marble. It was cast in bronze, modest and proud, and stood at the center of a newly built plaza in a Lagos suburb that had once been forgotten by development. The statue was of a woman, barefoot, wrapper tied high, arms outstretched holding corn in both hands. A plaque at its base read, "Mama Ngozi, the face of dignity." It was the official launch of the Corn Legacy Plaza, a thriving space where vendors sold under government-protected umbrellas, with healthcare booths, free childcare corners, and rotating community classes. Designed, built, and funded by Emeka Nwachukwu Holdings. But that morning, before the ceremony began, a man had walked in while it was still dark. He wore a plain shirt, no wristwatch, no security. He moved quietly, as though afraid his footsteps would be recognized. He approached the statue, dropped a perfectly roasted cob on the concrete base, and knelt. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He only bowed his head, the weight of years pressing against his shoulders. That man was Tunde, the same man who had once driven by a roadside stall, laughing at what he didn't understand. Now, he stood before the legacy of the woman who fed him in his youth without asking for anything in return. In the silence, his heart broke open, not from shame, but from the realization that wealth meant nothing without purpose. When the sun rose, The plaza staff arrived. They saw the corn, but didn't know who left it. Cameras caught only a faint shadow slipping away. That same day, something unusual happened online. Tunde deactivated all his social media accounts. Every photo of designer suits, foreign vacations, and champagne galas vanished. In their place, a quiet message appeared on his website. Taking time to reflect, returning to where I came from. Thank you for your patience. No press release followed. No interviews. Just silence. And in that silence, Tunde began the real work. He sold one of his luxury cars and used the funds to start a small vocational fund for widows in his neighborhood. He reached out, quietly, anonymously, to schools that needed supplies. He walked into places he once avoided, this time with respect in his eyes and his head bowed. He didn't announce it. He didn't need applause. His name didn't appear on banners. But in dusty classrooms and struggling clinics, money started showing up. Tools arrived. Shoes were bought. A few whispers started to circulate. It came from Tunde, I think. Emeka heard the whispers too. He had no interest in revenge. He had already moved on. But something in him shifted when he visited one of the vendor stalls and found a laminated printout of a blog post. It was written by Tunde under a pseudonym and titled, How Corn Humbled a King. The story didn't name names. It told of two boys, one who became rich with arrogance and another who stayed humble and changed the world. It ended with a single line. The boy who mocked the fire now warms his hands beside it. Emeka read it twice. Then he smiled. Not the smile of victory, the smile of peace. The kind only forgiveness can bring. 2 months later, the board of EN Foundation approved a partnership with a new urban development group quietly registered by an individual named Oluwatunde Resources. The application had no face, no fame, just plans, solid, thoughtful, community-focused. Emeka didn't reject it. He signed it without ceremony. A handshake wasn't necessary. The work would speak for itself. Years passed. The city changed. The stalls grew. Street vendors gained access to microloans and savings accounts. Students wore cleaner uniforms. And one day, a new statue was unveiled beside the first one. This one featured two boys, seated under a mango tree, sharing corn from a single wrapper. It was cast in bronze as well, simple and timeless. The plaque read, Friendship, restored by humility. At the unveiling, Emeka stood at a distance. So did Tunde. They didn't speak. They didn't pose for photos. They just watched the crowd pass by, parents explaining to their children what the statues meant. And in that quiet moment, the world turned gently, from ridicule to respect, from pride to peace. A lesson not shouted but lived. The corn still roasted across the plaza, but now it fed more than hunger. It fed dignity. And the man who once laughed had finally learned. The roads you mock today might be the very ones that carry you home tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more heartfelt stories to life, one soul at a time. Please subscribe the Folkteller Bae.